Gonna record. Good morning, everybody. This is Monday Talmud with Rabbi Goodman. We are here in the this is the Lehman. We are back in person, at least temporarily, but probably semi-permanently. So if you want to come into the building, you are welcome. This is the second, it's like we discussed this a couple months back, the wanderings of the Sanhedrin. This is the wanderings of the Sanhedrin. We have moved from 61C, where this class began, to the Lehman, to pandemic, which was in my living room, and then back to the Lehman after a very, very long time. So we're back, baby. And that's mostly just because my kids are at sleepaway camp and I can get up in the morning and come to morning minyan. So yeah, I'm very relaxed. There are no children asking me to make them Cheerios this morning. So it was great. We're going to do some Talmud.
I know. Which room is that? Which floor?
The Lehman is on the second floor. That's the conference room, people call it.
Okay, so that's where you would go. There's also a chapel there that's used for daily minyan on that floor.
Yeah.
That's
on that floor.
Okay, I'll stop now.
Take the elevator to the second floor. Great.
Yeah. Take the elevator and turn left. You can't miss it. The doors, it's all glass.
Yeah. So it's a weird little space. It's a conference room.
Beautiful.
With a Jerusalem stone space outside.
We met there before.
It's pretty wild. It's pretty great. All right. Let's do some Talmud. It's true Jerusalem stone. It was quarried in Jerusalem and carried here by gnomes, special gnomes. Who could carry them under what? No, I'm just kidding. I like making up stories. Like a couple of weeks ago, I said, because the Homestead Chapel is here, I said, oh, and the frieze over the Aron Kodesh, which is new, was taken from the Homestead synagogue down in Homestead. And Ira looks at me, Ira, who's our oldest Yinzer in the building, who, not our oldest, but our Yinzer of record in the building, looks at me and goes, no, it wasn't. I said, wait, this thing that someone told me is from Homestead is not from Homestead. He says, no, we got it at a yard sale. It's two lions and a Torah and the 10 Commandments over. It's like this beautiful black and red painted wooden like carving. And someone told me it was from Homestead. It was like, no, we got it at a yard sale.
At a yard sale?
That's what he said.
Story.
Who knows where these things come from?
Very well at that kind of
onward. We're going to do the daf today. We are on Rosh Hashanah 32b. If you're scoring at home, if you're doing the Safaria page, and I'm going to start having to print this out for people in the room, although Maddie's not going to be with us in 2 weeks because Maddie's going off to college, or not college, sorry, going off from college to college. Maddie's going to be a Jumpstart fellow for Springboard fellow for Hillel. So we wish her well. But Maddie was taking this class back in the day when Maddie wasn't actually taking classes. You were at Brandeis, yeah?
Yeah, I was at Brandeis and then older days.
Yeah, back in the old days. So, okay. And CDS back in the older days. Let's see if we can zoom this a little bit. Because it's so, all right, we'll go back a little bit. We have to find the Pakad debate, the great Pakad debate was where we left off. So we basically did 5 and then we started to debate Pakad. So remember last week we had a long conversation about whether, so we're debating in Rosh Hashanah the Musaf for Rosh Hashanah, which includes Zichronot, Malchuyot, and Shofarot. And there are these verses that you can append, or that you do append, that mention those 3 words in them, right? Whenever God is referred to as Melech in the Tanakh, you might choose to take one of those verses and put them into Malchuyot. And that is the liturgy for Malchuyot. The rabbis are implying that Zichronot, Malchuyot, and Shofarot are flexible, right? You can choose to put whatever verses from the Tanakh you want into that section. And then the rabbis started to debate earlier up in the page whether a verse that alludes to the destruction or desecration of the Jewish people is appropriate, right? So if a bad thing, if a verse mentions a disaster that befalls the Jews, should we omit that from the possible verses for Musaf? And they decide yes. And then further down, they say, but Purianot for Nochrim, right? Disasters that befall non-Jews are permitted, right? Which we dealt with as a theological question. Now we have then we had an analogous question, which is if pakad, if pakad, the word which sometimes is visited, sometimes is shielded, sometimes is remembered, is used in the Tanakh, is that analogous to zichron, right? And God, pakad et Sarah, is sometimes translated as God remembered Sarah. So pakad can be remembered, but pakad can also not be remembered. And I do not want to get back into last week's class where we went through 17 pages of the Brown Driver Briggs to figure out what pakad might mean. But rest assured, all of you proved that like pakad can mean a lot of different things. So we're going to kind of continue down that line and ask the question, what words are permitted and what words are not in this section? And remember, last thing that we're going to say about this is the rabbis having playtime, right? They're doing theology the way rabbis do, which is debating verses and figuring out what fits into the liturgy and what is appropriate to fit into the liturgy. With that, we'll start with 6. I think we did this last week, but I don't remember. Elisheva, if you will do us the honor of reading for us in the English. Ula Rabbi Yossi, nahi nami de fikdonot hare hen kazichronot, varonai pakad et sarah, pikadon diachidhu, de havin de atu rabin mina karabim damya.
The Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, although verses that speak of God revisiting man are equivalent to verses of remembrances, he cites the following verse as an example. And the Lord revisited Sarah, which is revisiting of an individual. Despite the fact that it was stated above that a remembrance must refer to the collective, since many descendants came from her, as Sarah is the mother of the Jewish people, she is considered like many. Therefore, this verse is effectively dealing with the remembrance of the entire Jewish people.
Great. So for
I
context,
love that reasoning.
yeah. For context up above, this is a debate that we ended with, which is Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda are having a debate. Rabbi Yehuda's response or comment on this is they are not equivalent to verses of remembrances. He didn't like it because he didn't think pakad and zichron are analogous enough. Yossi's response is a slight move, and it's a clever move, right? First of all, he holds that it is. He holds that the words are similar enough, but then he kind of pivots in an interesting way to saying, if your objection is that the phrase remembered Sarah is too specific, right? That you're saying it's remembered Sarah, and it doesn't really apply to us because we're not Sarah, or we're not being referred to in the plural in the collective of the Jewish people. Sarah is the mother of all of us, right? Even, and especially, and it's kind of cool, a convert is referred to as Ben or Bat Avram v'Sarah when they talk about their parentage. Now, by the way, there's a tshuva in the conservative movement that allows that for a person who doesn't want to go up to before the congregation and every time they get called for an aliyah, make it kind of publicly known that they converted, they can actually choose other names if they want to for reasons of kind of like avoiding any sense of embarrassment, which is kind of cool. But if you don't mind being called up as Avram Sarah, it's a great honor, right? It's an incredible thing to say, like,
were your parents' name?
Right. If your parents were Avram Sarah, that's even more convenient. But I'm Meir and Malka, so it's a little bit, Zalman and Malka, so it's a little bit easier for me. But anyways, the point is like Sarah is the mother of us all, and therefore she is a kind of very viable person. What's interesting about this is it's not exactly an immediate response to Rabbi Yehuda's take, but there's no reply to it. And in the Talmud, whenever we get a section where there's no reply, the assumption is it carries the day. That's the winning argument. All right. With that, we move into back and forth. That'll go on for a little while, which I think we did do last week, and then I kind of left off with. Marion, you're going to read this for us in the English, if it's okay by you. So Sharim Rashecha ve'chinsu pitrei olam yavo melech hakavod miuza melech hakavod Adonai izuz v'gibor Adonai gibor melchama. Me and Maddie and Dee just did this an hour ago in the because it's a Torah reading day, and we say this when we parade the Torah around, right? Useu pitrei olam v'yavo melech hakavod miuza melech hakavod Adonai tzod hu melech hakavod Sela Rishon Shnaim Shalosh Divrei Rabbi Yossi. Go ahead.
The Gemara discusses several verses from Psalms. Lift up your heads, O ye gates, and be lifted up, you everlasting doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. The psalm continues. Lift up your heads, O ye gates, and lift them up, you everlasting doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who then is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory, Selah. The first section is counted as 2 verses of kingship, as the term king is mentioned twice, while the second section is counted as 3 verses of kingship. This is the statement of Rabbi Yossi.
Okay, so the question, of course, now becomes, if you say the word melech multiple times in one verse, can you count it as multiple verses? Meaning, could we just do Susharim Roshech and Vizu Picholam Vayavo Melech Hakavod, me who's a Melech Hakavod, Adonai Izuz Gibor LaMilchama, and say, all right, we've knocked out 2 out of the 10, right? Or is every verse discrete in of its own, and therefore in individual mentions of the word melech should be compounded, and so on. This is kind of one of those arguments roughly approximating to the idea, how fast do we want to get through this part of the service, right? Like how much do we want to belabor the Musaf for Rosh Hashanah when people want to get to lunch? I'm having a flash of a reminder that there is a minyan in Jerusalem called the Leader Minyan. Some of you may have heard of it. And I think his name's Eben Leader. And Eben Leader is a rabbi of the Orthodox and Karlbach persuasion. And the Leader Minyan meets, I think, once a month in Jerusalem on the Rosh Chodesh, the Mavarchei Chodesh Shabbat. And it is, I would say, notorious for being long, right? Shlomo Karlbach liked to yadadai, and Eben Leader holds you should yadadai as much as you possibly can. And so the service is incredibly, incredibly long on Shabbat, right? They go into 2 o'clock, right? After starting at 8:30. So they just go and go and go and go. The only time I really went was on, and this was a brilliant idea by one of my colleagues in rabbinical school. The only time I went to the Leader Minyan was on Yom Kippur, because we weren't going anywhere anyway, so they could yadadai as much as they wanted, right? So this is really one of those questions of how long do you schlep out services? So Rabbi Yossi is holding you can make it long. Paula, you're going to do this line. It's real short, and then I'll give you 9 also. Okay, Paula? Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rishon Achat, Shnaim Shtayim.
Rabbi Yehuda says the first section is counted as only 1 verse of the kingship, as the question, who is the King of glory, is not considered a verse of kingship. By the same reasoning, the second section is counted as only 2 verses of kingship.
So again, Rabbi Yehuda disagreeing with Rabbi Yossi. Again, in this case, he is the concluding statement. And so we generally would assume that that is authoritative, which is interesting. Now you'll notice that the order flippity flopped, right? It was Yossi and Yehuda debating before, but last time it was Yossi starts, Yehuda interjects, Yossi concludes. Here it is Yossi starts, Yehuda responds, and we're done. So interesting. Rav Judy, go ahead.
I'm just a little flabbergasted that he would say that's not, who is the King of glory is not a verse of kingship, because that's part of being a king, to be glorious. It's weird. Certainly in the Hebrew. I find it just ridiculous. Actually.
Nice. I think it's interesting.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I think the argument is, the way I understand it is this, and you can disagree with me, anyone who does, because it ends with V'yavo melech hakavod, logically, mi ze melech hakavod is logically appended to the idea of V'yavo melech hakavod. So they're like basically the same idea or the same sentence. Therefore, you can't count them separately to knock it off. Go ahead, Elisheva.
Before you said that, what occurred to me was, if you're asking a question, who is this king? You haven't yet theoretically identified that king, and therefore you're not in fact referring to the king.
Mhm.
Right.
That's how I saw it. So-
Yeah. Well,
In that sense, it sort of makes sense.
right. So the thing that I've always been slightly confused about is that the word melech appears 4 times in here, but the rabbis talk about it. One rabbi talks about it as 3, and the other says, no, it's 2, right? Yavo melech hakavod, mihuza melech hakavod, yada, 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 yavo melech hakavod, mihuza melech hakavod. Adonai tzvot hu melech hakavod sela. Sorry, I apologize. 5 times the word melech appears. One rabbi says, no, it's 3 mentions. And the other rabbi says it's 2 mentions. Nobody holds it's 5 mentions. Oh wait, maybe not. Maybe that is the way Rabbi Yossi's reading it. Sorry. The second section is counted as 3 verses. The first section is counted as 2 verses. Maybe they're each understanding. Maybe he's understanding it as all 5. Yeah, I think that's right. Okay. So anyways, Judy, that's the argument. But I like that you hold by Rabbi Yehuda and you have strong feelings about it. All right. Let's see. We did this one before. No, we didn't do this one yet. We didn't do 9. Okay. Onward. Paula, you're going to keep doing 9. Zamru Elohim Zamru, Zamru Malkenu Zamru. Ki melech kol haaretz Elohim. Shtaim divrei Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Achat. V'shivin be melech Elohim al goyim Elohim yashav al kisei kodsho, shehi achat.
Similarly, the Gemara discusses the following verses. Sing praises to God, sing praises to our King, sing praises, for God is the King of all the earth. Sing praises in a skillful song. These are counted as 2 verses of kingship. This is the statement of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda says they count as only 1 verse of kingship, as the phrase, sing praises to our King, is referring to God as the King of the Jewish people, not the King of the entire world. And they both agree with regard to the verse, God reigns over the nations, God sits upon his sacred throne, that it is considered as only 1 verse of kingship, as the phrase sits upon his sacred throne is not referring to God explicitly as king.
Great. So they're doing 2 things here. And one of them is very clever, I think, or it's accidental, either way. Thing one that they're doing is continuing the logical debate from before, right? Yossi and Yehuda continue to hold the same way. And I apologize for getting a little bit mixed up before about the numbering, but basically this is the old joke that I've told many times in this class, which is they didn't require math in rabbinical school. And I forgot that 2 plus 3 equals 5, okay? But what we're seeing here is Yossi holds that because the word melech is used twice, it counts as 2 of our 10 verses, right? Again, Rabbi Yossi is the daven fast and let me get to lunch school of thought. And Rabbi Yehuda's argument is no, we need all the verses. That's thing 1 that they're doing, right? Continuing the logical debate. Thing 2 that they're doing, which is really valuable, is enunciating which verses they think should be in Malchuyot, right? And they're saying it matter-of-factly, like, oh yeah, when I go to services, we all know when they say Zamru Elohim Zamru, Zamru Lamalkem Zamru, that counts as 2 verses. The other rabbi goes, what are you talking about? That's only 1 verse, right? What they're doing there is saying, this is one of the verses from Malchuyot. Because by the way, we don't have any examples of what Zichronot, Malchuyot, and Shofarot should look like besides the Talmud, okay? So maybe they knew that they were putting down what is the liturgy for Musaf here, Or maybe they are assuming that we would 2,000 years after the Talmud was written, we would have copies of the original Machzor that they had. By the way, we don't, right? The oldest Machzor we have is Machzor Vitri, which is 1,000 years old. And because it's 1,000 years old, it follows the Talmud. And so therefore, they are either intentionally or accidentally laying down the prayers that we say, okay? This is not the only time that this happens. In Tractate Brachot, the rabbis mention kind of offhandedly, hey, you should say Ashrei 3 times a day, because anyone who says Ashrei 3 times a day is Ben Olam Haba, right? If you say Ashrei 3 times a day, no matter how much sin you commit in your entire life, you do not pass go, you do not collect $200, you go straight to heaven, right? The rabbis say that kind of like by the by. It seems to be, the way I've always interpreted it, kind of an anecdotal, like fun thing, which is, or it might be kind of like a homiletical or exaggerative statement, right? Which is another way of saying Psalm 145 is so awesome, we should all say it 3 times a day, right? Which is another way of saying like, oh my God, right? Rita's ice cream is so good, I go there every day during the summer, right? This is not a prescription by Rabbi Goodman for you to go to Rita's every day during the summer in order to derive joy in your life. But people, if I wrote it down in a book and it got codified into a religious text, you might think that observance of the Rita's holiday during the summer was chayav leben olam haba, that you would have to eat at Rita's in order to go to the world to come. For those of you in Carmiel, Rita's is our like frozen custard joint, which is only open from like Labor Day to like Memorial Day or something like that. But anyways, it's good. I like Rita's, but my kids don't like ice cream, so it doesn't work. Elenid, I see your hand. I'm going to get you in a second. But anyways, the point is, because Ashrei is announced in Brachot as a thing that we ought to say 3 times a day, either the rabbis are describing the fact that in their prayer books, they already had Ashrei multiple times, or more likely and more realistically, we follow the Talmud and put Ashrei into our prayer books 3 times a day, twice in the morning and once in the afternoon to start Mincha. Go ahead, Elenit. Elenit, you doing laundry?
Yeah, sorry.
There you go.
This is going back a little bit, but so it appears that Rabbi Yehuda is striking down the second instance of the word melech for cause.
Yes.
Not because he is inherently against the idea of one verse counting twice. So it seems that according to Rabbi Yehuda's view, it is theoretically possible for one verse that says melech multiple times to actually count several times. Otherwise, he wouldn't need a reason to strike it down. He could just say it's one verse, it's done.
Yes. So I want to go over that because I was going to get there, but I'm glad you got me there. No, I appreciate it. I was focused on what's called a rye, like the kind of discursive, like off-topic stuff. And you wanted to do keva. You wanted to stick to
well, no, you had also mentioned it earlier, and I was just slow in responding to it because I needed to get back to the text and actually look at it. But
right. The line that Steinsaltz includes at the very end, which is, it's only considered one verse of kingship, as the phrase sits upon his sacred throne is not referring to God explicitly as king, right? He just thinks Al Goyim Elohim Yeshav al Kiseh Kodsho is not enough of a kingship idea, right? Being enthroned is not literally melech. So this is analogous, I think, Elenid, if you disagree with me, that feel free. This is analogous to the debate over whether pakad could serve as a verse if it doesn't literally say zichron, or whether zichron can be kind of used in a more broad context. Again, we have an example here where they conclude with this, and therefore we interpret hypothetically that the winner of this argument is Rabbi Yehuda, although not necessarily so. By the way, I haven't looked at Malchuyot in order to see what comes in, but I do know for a fact that Zamru, Elohim Zamru is in there because I've been leading High Holiday liturgy for 20 years now, and that one sticks out of my mind as, oh yeah, we definitely see that. I'm pretty sure Se'usharim Roshechem is in there. I'm pretty sure the verse above that also appears. So I think everything that's here are not only hypothetical examples of things that might be permitted for Malchuyot. I think they are examples of things that wind up being our Malchuyot. And it's entirely possible that they are in Malchuyot because the rabbis here say they are. That these are our proof texts for why like a later rabbi was like, oh, they're debating what goes in Malchuyot. I should put that in Malchuyot, right? Like that's how they did it. The crib notes. Olivia, go ahead, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I'm just like, why isn't a throne kingship enough for them? Like if they said keter or crown or something like that, would that also not be enough kingship for them? Do they like?
Yeah, intellectually, I think we're having a broad-minded debate about originalism versus broader interpretation to think back to what occurred in America this past week regarding our Supreme Court, right? Which is, does the text literally need to say something in order for us to interpret it as such? Or if the text has gone off in a different direction, like for example, we read Brown v. Board of Education and a number of other things out of specific clauses in the Constitution that don't literally say, you know, blacks and whites should have equal access in education and schooling, but we read it out because that's the way the homiletical text says. But an originalist, a literalist would say, if it doesn't literally say zichron, you can't use it as zichron. If it doesn't literally say melech, you can't say, because it says al kiseh, it's like being a melech, where everybody knows the melech sits al kiseh, therefore we can use that, right? I will point out, and this is slightly opinion based, right? The decision that was rendered by the Supreme Court on Friday is in a logically directly contrasts another conservative Supreme Court opinion from 2007, which holds that the first clause of the Second Amendment, right, permitting American, I forget the phrase, but it's the literal, which is in order to establish militias, comma, the right
Regulated militia.
right, thank you, for purposes of a well-regulated militia, comma, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed upon, right? In 2007, in a Supreme Court case, they divorced the first clause of the Second Amendment from the second clause and said, you don't need to be a member of a well-regulated militia in order to have the right to bear arms. That is reading creatively, right? That is taking the literal of it and unreading it. Now, you could do that, but that also means that you might have to logically then say the permission of women to have the right to their own bodily autonomy for and pregnant people to have bodily autonomy to have abortions can be read out of the Constitution. This group of justices says no, it can't. So to be intellectually pure, we would also say, if we're going to be literalist with the Constitution, let's combine those two clauses of the Second Amendment. And now everyone in America who owns a gun needs to be part of a well-regulated militia. Soapbox is done. Moving on. But it's similar, Olivia, in the sense that, like, how literally do we need to read words? And if we read words literally here, ought we not read them literally everywhere? Right. And I think, Olivia, to the point, getting back to this text, is if we're going to be homiletical with the verses that we use, as the rabbis would say, im kan ein ledavar sof. If so, there is no end to it. There's a slippery slope problem, I think, Olivia, and I'm not disagreeing with you, because I think we should have broad permission to insert the verses in Malchuyot, Zichrot, and Shofanot that we get down with, right? That we like, but you know, im ken ein ledavar sof. If so, where's the end of it? Like, how kind of creatively could we read in ideas of Malchuyot? How much of an originalist versus a developmentalist do you want to be? Go ahead, Olivia. I want to hear your rebuttal.
In a much lower stakes way, I also think like God's throne is just pretty cool. Like,
yeah.
And they're like, we don't want to talk about kingship that's negative. We don't want to talk about like God being wrathful. And just like that description in Exodus about like the sapphires of God's footstool is just like a really nice, pretty verse. And if they just want like something that's very low stakes and just like, you know, pretty neutral as a king, sapphires that weren't even acquired through like exploitation of poor like gem gatherers, but are just like a supernatural thing. It's like a pretty solid God as king thing to talk about.
Yeah, I want to add one other thing about like adding and subtracting to the prayer book, especially the Machzor, which is medieval rabbis decided to introduce lots of what are called piyutim, liturgical poetry, to the prayer book. Because we had a lot of time on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to pray, and we wanted to add more stuff. There are lots of folks in the traditionalist world who believe that the prayer book should be ossified, right? That the prayer book ought not change because the rabbis of the Talmud laid it down as such, and they didn't allow for creativity. But here we have a very good example, and Olivia, you brought up a really good argument, which is basically like, but I really like the idea of God's throne, and I like the metaphor of the sapphires and the visions of that thing, right? And how beautiful it is. Why can't I put that into my prayer book? And the answer that the Talmud is basically giving is, you can, right? You're holding by either Yossi or Yehuda, but they don't, by the way, in both cases, they're just suggesting verses that they think ought to be there, but they don't necessarily say, they don't necessarily, they literally don't say, these have to be there, right? They don't even agree on how many to say, let alone what they are, which means that for the rabbis, they had a very broad-minded idea of what ought to be in the prayer book and what not. Back to my thing that I said about Ashrei. I'll give another example that I think about a lot, mostly in frustration, with the ossification of the prayer book. Tachanun has a set liturgy, right? There are words that are in our prayer book that it says, this is what Tachanun is, which I always find laughable because Tachanun is only mentioned in the entire Talmud once. And it's only mentioned in the story of the oven of Achnai, and it's mentioned as a rabbi put his head down to do Tachanun. And that is kind of seen as a contemplative prayer in which you berate yourself for all your failings, right? There is no mention of what Tachanun is, and there is definitely not a mention of, and these are the liturgies from which you might choose for Tachanun, right? Later rabbis decided to make Tachanun what it looks like today. So I'm not a radical. I'm not saying we should cut Shema because, you know, let's get crazy. But there's stuff in the prayer book that like is choose your own adventure. All right, Rabbi Judy, go ahead.
Just a reminder that the Talmud is not 2,000 years old, but more like 1,500 years old.
Right. You're charting
Yerushalayim,
yeah,
the Jerusalem Talmud in the 400s, and then the Bavli Talmud in the 500s, I think.
Let me just explain real quick, Judy. So when I say it's 2,000 years old, I'm dating to the beginning of it, which is that the first statements of the Talmud are from 30 before the Common Era.
Right.
And it's codified according to itself.
You're including the Mishnah.
Yeah, I'm saying the earliest bits of the Talmud. The latest bits of the Talmud are 476. Keep going.
Yeah, right. Gotcha. So that's one thing. And the other thing that I'm remembering from rabbinical school, which is fascinating, of course the prayer book isn't ossified because it's a living religion. It evolves. Who knew it would evolve the way it is with such a strong Orthodox branch in the United States, even though they may not be statistically that numerous, they are very vital and vibrant. So who would have expected that in 2022? But the piyutim, they were copying the Arabs pre-Islam. The Arabs wrote a lot of poetry. A lot of it was about love making and wine. And they wrote a lot of grammar books. So we also wrote grammar books, because if they wrote grammar books, we write grammar books. If they wrote love poetry, okay, we said it's about Hashem or whatever. If they wrote love poetry, we wrote love poetry. And just to show them, we put a lot of it in our prayer book.
Right.
So I don't know if everybody knows that. I didn't
No.
forget it. I've forgotten a lot, but I didn't forget it because I find that sociologically fascinating.
Yep.
But of course we take from the surrounding cultures.
Yep.
And we're doing it now. So what?
Yep. Elisheva, did you want to say something?
No,
Okay, great.
I was just emoting.
Nice. All right, let's cover some ground. It's good stuff, and we're going to kind of pivot back to trying to be attached to ideas that should be brought up in our zichronot. So they're moving away from things you can't choose for your verses to things you ought to choose. All right, Paula, do you mind reading us? Oh, you already did a whole bunch of work this morning. Let's have Ilanit, if Ilanit is not folding laundry, do verse 10 in the English. Zichron sheyesh bo trua kigon Shabbaton zichron trua mikra kodesh. Omra im hazichronot va'amra im hashofarot divrei Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda omer eno omra ela im hazichronot bilvad.
With regard to a verse of remembrance that also has a mention of sounding the shofar, for example, a solemn retreat, a memorial of blast, a sacred convocation, one may recite it with the verses of remembrance, and one may also recite it with the verses of the shofar. This is the statement of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda says one may recite it only with the verses of remembrance alone, as it does not explicitly mention a shofar.
Great. So we have another debate, bait Olivia, bait Rav Judy, which is how literal does it have to be, right? And
That's Stein's also adding it on though, because maybe it's just a bad example, right? If the theoretical question is, if there is a verse, and maybe there's only a finite number of verses in the Tanakh, maybe there isn't a good example, but the theoretical question is, if there is a verse that could actually be in both categories, can you use it for both, right? And Rabbi Yehuda says no, and then Steinsaltz is adding on this reason, well, this verse doesn't explicitly mention the shofar, right? So Steinsaltz is kind of reinterpreting what Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is.
You picked up something really good, Eleni, which made me run to my book. When Steinsaltz says something that seems
probably Rashi.
You got it. How come why do I teach this class when you're here? What are you doing? I'm gonna read to you Rashi, because Rashi.
What did she just say under her breath?
She said probably Rashi.
Said, why do I teach this class? What came before that?
She said probably Rashi, and she's dead on right, because by the way, Eleni, we had a full-on Vulcan mind meld there, because I literally went, you're objecting to a comment that Steinsaltz said. He says it very authoritatively. And I was like, if he says it with that much strength and it's that debatable, it probably comes from Rashi. Let me read to you what Rashi says in his fancy Rashi scripts. Eno omret ela im hazichronot. And then that's the beginning. One does not say it except that it is in regard to zichronot, meaning he's quoting this line from Rabbi Yehuda that it can't count for shofarot. Trua lav lashon shofarot hu, right? Trua does not use the language of the word, literally, shofar. Ad demachzir shofar bahade. But rather it kind of calls to mind the shofar only. And what we understand from that, Rashi, is Rabbi Yehuda understands it as when you use the word trua, but not the word shofar, you can't count it in shofar. That's it. So that's why Steinsaltz says it so authoritatively down there. But again, it's back to our idea of whether, because I think you're right, Eleni, the idea could have been this: you can't use a verse for double duty, right? Imagine you were like, I don't want to do extra work this year in finding special verses for each of the prayers. So I'll just reuse Shabbaton Zichron Trua Mikre Kodesh in Zichronot, and I'll use it again in Shofarot, because then I've got a double duty verse, right? He says, no, you can't do that. it could be that you can't use a verse twice in two different places, but to Rashi's idea, you can't use it because it doesn't fall under the category of it literally says the word shofar, because trua doesn't literally say it. Olivia would disagree. All right, let's keep going. Marion, go ahead, and then you're going to read 11.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it seems to me they found enough verses with the word zicharon or with the word shofar. So why argue about these other verses?
Right. I think that's right. And it's again to this kind of argument. You can find lots and lots of verses with the word zichron, shofar, or melech. Why use a verse that doesn't literally say that? And the answer is, for Olivia, because it's nice and because you can, right? And I think I hold bait Olivia in this one, but you know, there's no winners or losers here in Monday morning Talmud. We're all winners we're all junior pioneers. Yes, we are. We're all winners here at the school of Monday morning Talmud. All right, with that, Marion, you're going to read the English for for line 11.
I did read already, but okay.
What's that?
I read already, but I'm willing.
And you
to
may
read
not
again.
read again. It's forbidden. Let's say Renee hasn't done anything. Renee, we're putting you to work. Renee, tell Art to put the coffee down. You're reading Talmud this morning. Leave Art alone, Bobola. All right. I mean, I assume that's Art. It could be somebody else. I don't know. Malchut sheyesh imo trua, kigon Adonai Elohav imo utruat melech bo, omra im ha-malchiot, va'omra im ha-shofarot, divrei Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda omer, eno omra ele im ha-malchuyot bilvad. Go ahead, Renee, and say with regard once you unmute.
With regard to a verse of kingship that also has a mention of sounding the shofar. For example, the Lord his God is with him, and the sounding of a king is among them. One may recite it with the verses of kingship, and one may recite it with the verses of shofarot. This is the statement of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda says one may recite it only with the verses of kingship.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything about this that we didn't say in the verse above, right? The word trua appears. You can't say it for shofar. You can't use it twice if you wanted to use it twice. All right, onward. Let's see. We'll go back. Miriam, Judy hasn't read yet. Verse 12, line 12, not verse. Line.
Judy should be exempt from reading because she talks so much.
You said it, not me. But
No.
we like it. I mean, you know.
I want to read. I know. Read.
I appreciate it. You've sent Maddie into conniptions over here. Maddie is busting a gut. I don't think Maddie is very familiar with Rob Judy's level of honesty constantly in the universe, but we love it. I am here for it, girl. All right. Trua she'eni ima lo klum kigon yom trua yihi lachem omra im hashofarot divrei Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda omer eno omra kol ikar.
With regard to a verse that mentions sounding the shofar that has nothing else with it, no mention of remembrances, kingship, or an actual shofar. For example, it is a day of sounding the shofar to you. One may recite it with the verses of shofarot. This is the statement of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda says one may not recite it at all, as it contains no explicit mention of a shofar.
This is one of those rare places where I think Steinsaltz's team for bolding and italics dropped the ball here, because he italicizes the word shofar and bolds the word the in that middle line. And I think it better would be read, it is a day of sounding, parenthesis, or like non-bolded the shofar to you.
Right.
But specifically the word shofar does not appear here, right? Nor the word the, but that's another matter. But basically, like, this follows everything we've already learned, right? The word shofar isn't there. Yossi holds you can use it. Yehuda says you can't for shofar, because trua is, we all know, like shofar enough. Renee, go ahead.
this may have nothing to do with it, but what else would you sound? Is there no assumption there?
Right.
Yeah, right.
Right. I think you're making the same argument that Yossi's making, which is like truah can't refer to anything other than a shofar. Therefore, you should use it. But yeah, it's about literalism, I think, in law. All right, with that, we are going to go back to Marion, I think, because we're running through our folks once more. Ma'achil b'Torah. Now we finally changed topics to something slightly different. Ma'achil b'Torah u'mashlim b'nevi'im. Rabbi Yossi Omer, im hishlim b'Torah yatsa, im hishlim di'avad in lachatchila lo. V'hatanya Rabbi Yossi Omer, hamashlim b'Torah hareza meshubach, ema mashlim.
The Mishnah taught, when reciting the 10 verses, one begins with verses from the Torah and concludes with verses from the prophets. Rabbi Yossi says, if he concluded with a verse from the Torah, he has fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara notes that Rabbi Yossi's formulation, if he concluded, indicates that after the fact, yes, he has fulfilled his obligation. Ab initio, no, he has not fulfilled his obligation to recite the necessary verses. The Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Yossi says, one who concludes the series of verses with a verse from the Torah is praiseworthy? The Gemara answers, say that the text of the Mishnah must be modified so that it reads, Rabbi Yossi says, he concludes with a verse from the Torah. That is, one should do so ab initio.
Okay, so I don't know that the Latin phrase ab initio is going to help anybody here. This is what's referred to, and it literally appears here in our, and if Rabbi Jeremy were here, he would tell us that it's time to break out our technical terms. This is what's called lahatchila b'diavad, and here those words appear literally on the page. Diavad means kind of before the fact, after the fact, and lahatchila is after the fact. So from the beginning, when I'll give you a simple example, right? From the beginning, if I were leading services and I forgot Shema, right? And I did the Amidah, and then Dee raised her hand after I finished the Amidah and said, Rabbi, you forgot to say Shema and Ve'ahavta. I'd say, oh, you're right. Let's do that now, right? After the fact, right? After you've already made the mistake, you do fulfill your obligation for reciting Shema and Ve'ahavta if you do it out of order from Amidah. However, that does not necessarily mean that we as a congregation should do Amidah and then Shema every single day, right? That's not the right way to do it. However, if you do it that way after the fact, you're good, right? A more contemporary example, you're changing a tire. There's 5 lug nuts. You put 3 lug nuts back on and you slip the other 2 in your pocket. Bubala, you shouldn't do that. However, if you do that and you drive around all day, you're probably fine, right? It's probably okay, but it's not the ideal way to do things. That's how lahatchila b'diavad works. So the statement that's made here is, the Mishnah says you begin with Torah and conclude with Nevi'im, right? Meaning if you're doing 10 verses, you can start with something from the Chumash, right? The first 5 books of Moses, and then you conclude with something from the Nevi'im, from one of the prophets. However, Rabbi Yossi says, if you can conclude with a verse from Torah, and the rabbis are kind of arguing, right? Like the Talmud, the Gemara, which comes later than Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, who are Mishnaic rabbis, they're saying he doesn't mean that you can literally drive around with 3 lug nuts. He doesn't literally mean you can drive around having said Amidah followed by Shema every single day. Bubala, that is not the way to do things. What he really, I'm using Bubala a lot. I just finished the Paramount series called The Offer, which is a 9-part series about how whatchamacallit, Godfather came to be made into a movie, the greatest movie of all time. And Robert Evans, the famous producer, calls everyone booby all day long. It's just booby all day long. And so I'm slipping into that all day. You're all very lucky that I'm not talking like Bob Evans as I teach this class. Booby, the Talmud tells you, you gotta put Jack Nicholson in the show. He's fantastic, baby. You don't understand. All right, anyway. I just told people on the internet that I'm not funny and I don't try to be, and here I am trying to be funny. Renee's not laughing, not at all. All right, okay.
That's okay, you have a good audience here.
We've got a laugh track in the studio, folks. Maybe that's why I'm trying to be funny, because I can actually hear laughter for once.
Right on, Olivia.
Yeah. So anyhow, that's the Hatchila b'diavad here, but they're really arguing about whether Rabbi Yossi is appropriate in his argument. To be honest, I feel like the Gemara is undercutting him here. I think Rabbi Yossi very literally says, if you want to start with Torah, do Nevi'im, and then bring in a Torah verse from Exodus or Genesis, you can do that, right? That's totally fine. The Talmud says, no, you can't do that. And he didn't mean that you can do that. He meant that if you screw up and you do it, you have fulfilled your obligation. You didn't do anything wrong. So it's an interesting argument. It's an interesting argument. By the way, the reason the Gemara probably cleans it up that way is they probably believe that Rabbi Yossi, who lived as a contemporary with the Mishnah, would never disagree with Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the editor of the Mishnah, because that's not the way it was done. An academic would probably argue Rabbi Yossi lived contemporarily with Rabbi Yehuda, and so he can very much completely disagree with the Mishnah. And if the Mishnah were not codified as such, there's no argument that he's doing it wrong. He just does it differently. All right, let's do one more verse to call it a day, and then we'll call it a day. It's going to continue along this thread. We may need a little bit more time next week to unpack it, but that's why we're here. With that, I'm going to ask Paula to read this again, making Paula do extra work today. Vaha im hishlim katani diavad in lahatchila la hachi kamar machil b'Torah umashlim b'nevi'im. Rabbi Yossi Omer mashlim b'Torah im hishlim b'nevi'im yatsa tanya nami hachi amar Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Yossi vatikin hayu mashlimin oto b'Torah.
Gemara raises a difficulty. Doesn't the Mishnah teach if he's concluded? This indicates that after the fact, yes, one has fulfilled his obligation. Ab anitio, no. He has not fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara answers that this is what the Mishnah is saying. One begins with verses from the Torah and concludes with a single verse from the prophets. Rabbi Yossi says one concludes with a single verse from the Torah. If he has concluded with a single verse from the prophets, he has fulfilled his obligation. This is also taught in a Baraita. Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Yossi, said, pious individuals who were scrupulous in their performance of mitzvot would conclude the series with a single verse from the Torah. Presumably, Rabbi Elazar followed the opinion of his father, Rabbi Yossi.
Right. So this line objects with the previous line, right? What it's saying is the logic doesn't hold that this is exactly that Rabbi Yossi would have objected in this manner, but rather because the Talmud, because it uses the word mashlim, implies very strongly that it is already a b'diavad lahatchila position. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi would not have meant it to mean that way. And then it continues to pound that idea home by really kind of laying it out by saying like, no, Rabbi Yossi didn't object like explicitly on these grounds. He objected on the grounds that there is a Baraita that supports his position that literally says you can lahatchila intentionally conclude with a verse from Torah. And it goes furthermore, there's a Baraita that says vatikim would conclude with a verse from Torah, which very much implies that this is the way you ought to do it, right? So there's this really strong debate with really good sources that says, not only is it not an accident to conclude with a verse, like, for example, from Exodus, it's probably preferable to conclude with a verse from Exodus. The last thing I'll say about is this: the word vatikim does not appear a lot in the Gemara. It's very interesting. It's referred to, a vatik today is, in modern Hebrew, Elisheva and Mary, and you probably know this as veteran, right? Or
You get half fare on the bus.
Yeah.
Old timer or somebody's been around.
You're
a long
Vati.
time.
Yeah. Vatikim. So in the religious world, there's an expression for vatikim, and that is if you show up to pray in the early morning service, which we have at Beth Shalom on Shabbat. We have a 6 a.m. minyan, right? If you're here for the 6:15 minyan for Shabbat, that is referred to in the religious world as davening vatikim, right? That you're the pious, or you're the veterans. All right, Eleni, ask your question, and then we'll call it a day.
I don't know if you know the answer to this, and I don't have a sense, but how common is it in Mishnaic Hebrew to use mashlim to mean to finish? Like, I'm trying to get a sense of like how strong of an argument that is. Like, is it really actually an unusual word to use in that context, or is it actually fairly common to just use that to mean like to finish or to like conclude?
That's a good question. As you asked the question, for me, I remember reading it. I'll say it very, very quickly, which is when I read it here, it didn't strike me as odd. It felt normal. But as I'm thinking about it, because I guess maybe I'm just moving too fast. But as I'm thinking about it, I think the argument that you were making, if I'm not mistaken, is you would have expected the word to be lesayem, right? To finish, to conclude.
Maybe, my Mishnaic Hebrew is not good enough to know what I should have expected.
I mean, the great thing about Mishnaic Hebrew is it tends to be really simple. And I know the word lesayem does appear in the Mishnah. So the question of why are they using mashlim? I mean, the word mashlim best translates, correct me if I'm wrong, modern Israeli speakers on a daily basis, as complete. That would be a better direct translation from the Hebrew word shalem, to do whole.
To make whole.
But complete and conclude, you could argue, are analogous. You could argue they are not analogous. They're not the same thing.
But interesting that mashlim is the same root as shalom or shalem, which means whole, peace.
That's right.
But
All
the
right, we're going
root
to call that a
is
day.
wholeness,
Go ahead.
is completeness,
Yeah.
and peace derives from that.
We're going to call that a full lid, call it a day. Thanks to everyone for our Monday morning Talmud class. I'll see you in 2 weeks. We're going to take a week off to celebrate America's independence from our British overlords.
We're having an ice cream party to celebrate that.
Mostly I'm just in Colorado at a soccer game, which would just be great.
I've got an opera that night, so I can't eat ice cream at
Renee,
Enjoy
I'm
the
gonna
opera.
call you